When it comes to temptation and lust, I have found that when we misunderstand these things, there's a lot of unnecessary problems and pain in our life. And so we need to have a clear understanding of what is temptation and what is lust when it comes to our body and how it impacts all five dimensions. When we misunderstand temptation in particular, I have found that it can lead to chronic shame, unnecessary shame, misinformed shame, but also for some men, if they misunderstand what is temptation, it can lead to a sense of learned helplessness in the way they handle temptation. And so we want to hopefully bring clarity today. And if we don't have a proper understanding of what is lust, the psychological term would be objectification. The biblical term would be lust, but it's really describing very similar things. When there's misunderstanding about what is lust, it can lead to additional bondage in our lives. So we want to bring some clarity today. The very first thing I want to start off with is to talk about my own higher power, which is Jesus, and the fact that Jesus was tempted. Jesus had a nervous system just like yours. He had the same hormones in his body, nervous system in his body that you and I have. God had a body. He took on flesh. He can empathize with our temptations because Hebrews says Jesus was tempted in every way, same way you and I are. We don't have a God who cannot empathize with what we go through when we are tempted. But here's what was very unique about Jesus. Hebrews says he was tempted in every way, yet without sin. So in his body, he had a nervous system like you and I. He had hormones like you and I. He had appetites, desires, and drives, just like you and I. He had a body that needed rest and would at times become fatigued, just like you and I. And he had two eyes that was taking in the environment around him, just like you and I. He had the same five senses that you and I have. And he faced every temptation known to man, yet without crossing the line. He never did anything immoral. He never committed any sin in that temptation. What stands out to me is this very important principle. Temptation is not a sin. And we need to understand that temptation is exposure, but sin is engaging it. Think about it this way in the terms of the distinction between temptation and giving into temptation, which for the purpose of our talk today, there's a lot of different things we could be tempted about and give into, but we're talking about specifically in recovery, lust. Here's a distinction. Temptation is the knock at the door. In your house right now, you have no control, for the most part, over who stops by and knocks on your door. That's out of your control. Anybody could come by for most of your homes. Anybody could come by at any time and they can knock on the door. That's temptation. You had agency over whether you open that door or not and invite them into your house. That's what you have control over. That's where your will kicks in. Your will has no play, no role when it comes to who knocks on your door. But when you open it, that is an act of your will. So temptation is the knocking. Lust is opening the door and inviting that into your person, into your home. Temptation is the invitation, but lust is the participation. Temptation is the opportunity. Lust is giving consent to that opportunity. Temptation is inevitable. As long as you have a body, you will face temptation. It will not go away. You will never reach a point in your development and growth where there's no temptation, because this is simply an opportunity. That's all this is. This is an opportunity. However, lust is a choice. It's not inevitable. Temptation, inevitable. Lust, totally avoidable. Totally a choice. Another way to understand biblically what the word temptation means is to also see it as simply a test. Every temptation is a test. Jesus, when he started his ministry, the Holy Spirit led him into the desert and he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the tempter tempted him. It was a test. And there were 3 different tests, 3 different temptations that he went through, and he passed each one of them. There was no sin. So here's what we need to be careful of. If we collapse these 2 into the same category, you will live in chronic shame, and betrayed partners will live in chronic fear. So we need to understand that difference. Temptation has no moral value whatsoever. It's what you do with that temptation. Do you pass the test or do you fail the test? There is a line that if you cross it, it becomes a moral violation. It becomes a sin. And that line is very, very clear. And we're going to talk about that line today. But if you fail a test yesterday, if there was a temptation and you gave into it, what you are not to do with that failed test is to give up, to resign, and just stay on this side and begin to think, well, I've already blown it, so I might as well just go all out. And that's when some guys will just go on a bender. They give up, they resign, they collapse into shame. What we need to do, if there is a test that we fail, what we need to quickly do is step back into integrity, confess that. That means bring it into the light, disclose that to God and our partner, repent from that, find the distorted thinking, the lies that were whispered to you, do a root cause analysis of how did I fail this test, and quickly step back into integrity to repair the harm that was caused and to learn from this lesson so that next time you're tested, you don't fail, but you're stronger, you're better, you're more informed, and you're not going to give up and go into shame. But healthy guilt is going to lead to action where you step back into integrity, quick repair, learn from this, be better because of this, and make sure the next time I'm tested like this, I will pass. That's the proper way to handle the test and the proper way to handle failure. So one of the things I want us to understand is when it comes to the body, there is one particular part of our body that is the gateway to lust, and that is our eyes. And so we need to be very careful with that gateway and what we do with our eyes. There's a great verse in Job 31 that some of you may be familiar with it and you didn't even know it, because this is what it says. Job, who was a very God-fearing, righteous, integrous man, said this in chapter 31. He said, I have made a covenant with my eyes not to gaze lustfully at a woman. That was the theme verse that started an accountability software that was originally called Covenant Eyes. That was their theme verse. It came from that verse in Job. I think recently, I think I heard that they changed the name of their software to something else, but many of us, if you've been in recovery for a while, you're probably familiar with Covenant Eyes. Well, it comes from Job 31. And what Job is saying is, I have made a covenant with a certain part of my body. I've entered into a solemn, sacred agreement with my eyes that we are not going to lust after anyone. That's not going to happen. So I want to break down that particular verse into 4 key words that if we understand, it's going to bring clarity when it comes to temptation and lust. The very first word that shows up in that verse is covenant. What does he mean by covenant? Let me tell you what he doesn't mean. He doesn't mean contract. It's much, much deeper and more profound. In fact, in the Hebrew language, which is what Job 31 is in, it's originally in Hebrew, their word for covenant, and their language in particular, is much more pictorial and poetic and their words paint pictures. And the word covenant literally means to cut, to shed blood. That's what the word covenant means. It literally means to cut. And we get that from the original covenant that God made with Abraham. When he made a promise, a covenant, a solemn, sacred oath to Abraham. This is how he confirmed that covenant. He had Abraham take a bull, cut it in half, separate the two halves, and walk between the middle of that cut bull. And this was the symbol, this was the message. If I violate this covenant, may what happened to this bull just now happen to me. May there be severe consequences if I violate this commitment that I'm making. So a covenant is out of any form of contract, promise, oath, commitment that a human could make, the highest form that includes God in it is called a covenant. And it is a severe, it is an extreme, it is a deep, it is a holistic, sacred oath, vow, commitment that may there be severe consequences if I break this covenant. So what I want you to see is this is the level of commitment that Job is making to his eyes. What it means is this: a covenant is a pre-decision. It's a pre-decision. What was supposed to happen at your wedding when you entered into a covenant was the sacred oath with God as a witness, and part of that vow, part of that sacred, solemn promise to each other, that I am making a pre-decision, that I don't just love you and pledge faithfulness and fidelity to you today, but I am pre-deciding that I am going to love you in sickness and in health, in all of our tomorrows. I am going to be faithful and loyal to you. I am pre-deciding our future. That this is my covenant to you. A covenant is a pre-decision. Job is saying, I have pre-decided that no matter what environment I am, no matter what temptation I face, I've pre-decided what I'm going to do with my eyes because they are the gateway to lust. So I've made a covenant, an oath, a sacred agreement with my eyes that we're not going to do this. I am going to maintain what some of us call custody of my eyes. That I'm going to look down, I'm going to bounce my eyes, I'm going to look away, I'm going to avoid certain environments and certain areas. In today's world, certain media, certain technology, certain shows, certain movies, I am going to pre-decide that these eyes are not going to be the gateway to lusting after another person. And that's the other thing we need to understand in this verse is not only do we need to understand the word covenant, but we need to understand what do we mean by eye in particular. Jesus said the eye is the lamp to the whole person, that it is the gateway. And he went on to say, when he taught a very similar verse on lust in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, this is how Jesus put it. He did a contrast. He said, you've heard it said, even in the 10 Commandments, don't commit adultery. That's breaking a covenant. But I say this, anyone who looks upon someone else with the intention of lusting has committed adultery in their heart already. So he was saying, as he was talking about what lust does to our life, he wanted us to understand that it's not just what we do with our body, it's what we allow to come through the gateway of our eyes and enter into our will, and we have the intention of lusting after that person. That the eye is the gateway, that we need to be careful what we are gazing at, because that's how it starts. And he said, you've got to go to extreme measures to eradicate lust from your life. He said, because lust leads to Gehenna. And that word was very familiar with his audience. We don't have a context for that word today. But what he was saying was, if you engage in lust, if that is your way of interacting with the temptations around you, and you just lust after people, it will lead to scorched earth in your life, dumpster fire. Gehenna was the landfill outside of the city of Jerusalem. It's where all the citizens dumped their trash. And there were employees that tended to that landfill by constantly lighting it on fire so that when you walked by, it looked like a lake of fire, and it was called Gehenna. And Jesus was using that as an illustration of the power of lust and what it will do to your life if you let your guard down and you don't go to extreme measures to make sure you make a covenant with your eyes not to lust after other people. And for those of us who are in recovery and we're on this side of recovery and we look back at our lives and the root of all of our sexual integrity issues could be reduced back to this, we would have to agree. My life was destroyed, scorched earth, dumpster fire, ash heap, because of the destructive power of lust in my life. What did Jesus say to do about it? He used what's called hyperbole. He said, if your eye causes you to lust, gouge it out. Now, he wasn't being serious. We're not to take that literally. None of us would have eyeballs in recovery if that's what he was literally saying. What he was saying is this: you've got to go to extreme measures to make sure that lust does not lead to the destruction of your life, that we underestimate the destructive power of this particular sin. And lust grows into all sorts of sexual sins, but it begins with lust. And so he's saying, go to extreme measures. Do whatever you have to do. You don't need to get rid of the people in your life. They're not the problem. Your gaze is the problem. You need to deal with your eyes. You need to deal with the way you're looking at people. They're not the problem. Oh, but they were wearing this. Did you see what they were wearing? If they would just dress more modestly, then I wouldn't have an issue. No, that's blame shifting. That's victim blaming. It's not caused because of what they wear. It's caused because of the way you look. That Jesus said, you don't deal with the woman or man that you're objectifying. They're not the problem. You deal with your eyes. That's the problem. You do whatever you have to do to change the way you look at people, because the consequences are so severe. And so some people, when they hear some of the measures that I go to make sure that I don't engage in lust, some people have told me, that's so extreme. That's so ridiculous. That who would want to live like that? And I understand where they're coming from, but I can't let my guard down when it comes to the destructive power that lust had in my life. I don't live in fear. That's not what I'm talking about. But I live with a healthy respect of what lust did to my family, to my life, to my integrity. And I need to do whatever it takes to make sure I contain that, specifically my eyes, so that I never go down that path again. Well, we talked about covenant, we talked about eye, but what about the word lust? What exactly does that mean? We need to understand that. The word lust, both in the Hebrew and the Greek, in Job 31 and Matthew 5, means the same thing. It simply means intense desire. That's all it literally means. Intense desire. Lust is when that desire is disordered. For example, Jesus never engaged in disordered desire. He never engaged in lusting after another woman. In fact, interesting story. There's one story where a woman was set up, entrapped, caught in the act of adultery, and was taken by the religious leaders and put in front of Jesus as a trap to him to see, are you going to follow the law of Moses and have this woman stoned right now, or are you going to give her grace? And so it was a double bind. It was a no-win situation. And when you look at that narrative, the behavior of Jesus is quite peculiar. And the story doesn't say what exactly was going on in his mind. It just talks about what he does with his eyes. And if you're familiar with the story, do you remember what he did? They brought this woman who had just been in the act of adultery. So who knows if she's undressed or partially dressed or, what state she's in as she is brought before him. pretty much as an object by these religious leaders and bait to trap Jesus. And you know what he does? He looks down. The story says he draws in the dirt. I can't prove that what he was doing was, quote, bouncing his eyes, which is one of the methods I use to contain my eyes. But I will say that he handled this delicate situation with grace, with honor, with respect. And his comment to the religious leaders was brilliant. He basically said, okay, let's go ahead and throw the rocks. Whoever is perfect and without any sin in your life, why don't you go first? Cast the first stone. And the story says that they all walked away from oldest to youngest, and there were no accusers left to accuse her. But Jesus, and he didn't accuse her. He said, you're forgiven, go and sin no more. So when it comes to what we do with our eyes, we've got to do whatever it takes to make sure we don't cross the line from temptation to lust. Lust is a disordered desire. It means that I am looking at this person and I am coveting them. I want them for my pleasure. I have reduced them to an object. They're no longer a person. I am sexualizing them and I want to possess them. I want them to be mine. And so it is a look of desire, of possession, of objectifying, of sexualizing, of coveting. It's committing adultery with them internally instead of externally. And so there's one more word in this verse that is absolutely essential, and it's the word gaze. Gaze. And let's talk about that, what that word means. The word gaze, when Job says, I have made a covenant with my eyes not to gaze upon a person with lust. Gaze means to assess, to examine, to carefully study, to contemplate. It is not the word glance, which was readily available to both Job and Jesus when they taught about lust. They did not equate glancing at a person with lust. They said gaze. So let's see if we can draw the distinction here. Glancing is noticing a person, just noticing them. It's involuntary. You're going to notice people. They're going to cross your line of sight, and there could be a glance. There is no moral value to that whatsoever. However, that glance could become a temptation to cross the line into lust, which is gazing, assessing, examining, carefully studying, contemplating, desiring, objectifying, sexualizing. And men, do not be self-deceived. You know the difference. And you know the difference. You know where that line is. And if you cross that line, you are fully aware of it. That the glance became a lustful gaze. And you know when that happens. There is a third option that we want to throw out there, and that is to bring God into the perspective. So these two are integrity, glancing and looking away, and seeing that as God's daughter or God's. And I don't care if you're opposite sex attracted or same sex attracted, same principle applies. Glancing and seeing them from God's perspective, that this is an image bearer of God, worthy of dignity, value, and respect. This is God's daughter. This is God's son. And this is someone else's covenant partner or future covenant partner. My desire is meant for my covenant partner, like we talked about last week. I am wired for an exclusive relationship in a covenant with a partner. From my biochemistry to my attachment circuitry, everything that God put in my biology, it's designed for covenant. That's where desire is properly ordered. That's where it's godly. Think about it this way. If it's cold today and you've got a fireplace, you may take some logs and start a fire in that fireplace, and it brings benefit and warmth and comfort to the entire home, because that fire is in its proper place. And when it's in its proper place, it brings benefit to everyone. But if you take those logs and you start the fire on your dining room table, you're going to burn the whole house down. It's the same fire, but the wrong container. Covenant is the container for our sexuality. And it was designed for that container. And when it stays in that container, it is beautiful and life-giving and God-pleasing and righteous and integritous. Our desire, our sexuality is meant to be in that container. When it spills out of that container, scorched earth, Gehenna. So that's the power of lust in our life. If you think about the very first sin with the very first couple, it was lust. What God did with Adam and Eve was he put them in a garden and he said, you can eat from any tree, all the fruit, bountiful, the whole garden. But there's only one commandment, not 10, there's one. Only one rule. I've got this tree right in the middle and I don't want you to eat from that tree. It is a test. God calls it a test. The tempter calls it a temptation. God wants you to pass and prove your love and loyalty to him. The enemy wants you to fail and stay in failure. So every day they would pass by and they would glance at that tree and they would move on. But one day the tempter is right next to that tree and he whispers them to gaze at it. He says, you're missing out. God's holding you back. He doesn't want you to eat from this tree because he knows you'll be powerful when you do. You'll be just like God. You deserve this. Look how satisfying this looks. And the story says that Eve and Adam was right next to her, not leading, not protecting her, but passive. Eve looked, and it looked desirable. And she wanted the power that would come with it. And so she ate, she handed it to her husband, he ate, and shame entered our existence. The first sin was lust. It went from temptation and a glance to the tempter crossing the line to gaze, to desire, and to take action. So what do we do with this? We want to make sure that our glance never becomes a gaze of desire, a gaze of lust. What is needed is containment. So let me tell you what this looks like in my own life and my own journey. And then the share time, we can talk more about it. So this is what it looks like in my life. My goal every day when I check in with Jacqueline, every 24 hours, is to be able to report to her that not only did I not gaze lustfully at someone, but I navigated my day to where I never even had to bounce my eyes because I didn't take a glance at anyone. An attractive woman that would be a temptation for me. That's my goal every day. And so I go to extreme measures to try and achieve that goal. My goal is good news, Jacqueline. Past 24 hours, I didn't even have to bounce my eyes. Because the way I handled technology and going out in public and navigating this sex-saturated, tempting environment that we live in our world is I navigated in such a way that I made a covenant with my eyes that I was not going to do this. And in fact, I try to contain this as much as possible. So this wasn't even an opportunity. So what does that look like? I work out at home. I don't go to a gym. That's containment. That's minimizing the glances, the opportunity for gazing. I get my groceries delivered. I don't go to the grocery store. There have been times when she and I will go out, and if it's going to be a really crowded place, I have specific glasses that have a magnification that makes everything blurry within like 3 feet out. I call them freedom frames. Some of you have heard me talk about this. Sounds extreme, doesn't it? When I go somewhere, I keep my eyes down and I go to whatever my objective is, get that thing, put my eyes back down, go back to my car and come home. Now, the way I watch football is on YouTube TV with just the 40-something highlights of the game, and there's no cheerleaders, and there's no people in stands, and there's no commercials. So what am I doing is I'm trying to contain the glances that I experience in my day, because that is less temptation for me and makes it easier to avoid a lustful gaze. So my goal is every day, as I maintain shared reality with Jacqueline, and shared reality is I let her know, how did I handle temptation today? That's shared reality. Not every partner would prefer that, and they can have a boundary around that. But many partners, they feel safe knowing, how did you handle temptation today? And did you have to bounce your eyes, or did you fail to bounce your eyes today? And they want that to be shared reality. That is part of our relational agreement. That's part of our couple show. My goal every day is to be able to report to her, I didn't even have to bounce my eyes. Because you know what's easier than bouncing your eyes? Not having to bounce your eyes, because you contained the amount of noticing of people in your day. Now, even with that container in my life, there are still going to be times when an attractive person, a temptation, will cross my line of view. That moment is a test. There is a clear line. And I try to live my life where I stay what I call 5 feet from the line, that I have a healthy respect for the destructive power of lust. I don't want to dance with this. I don't want to entertain this. I have pre-decided what I'm going to do with temptation. I'm not going to play with it in the moment and try to figure it out. Some of you, this is what we call a safety plan. You're going to go on a trip? Or are you going to go to an environment that's going to be full of temptation and you can't get out of it? You have to go. What is your safety plan to stay 5 feet from the line, to make sure you don't cross the line, that it doesn't go from a glance to a gaze? And so the containers that I have in my life, it's mutually beneficial. Lust is the shared enemy of Jacqueline and I. If I don't engage in lust, there will be no other sexual integrity issues, because it begins there. That is the root. The rest is the fruit. So I've got to crack this code at the root, at that level, that there can be no tolerance for lust in my life. That cannot happen again. Here's what I've noticed after years of practicing this. Lust, and I'm just going to admit this candidly, lust was integrated into who I was. It did not require a lot of effort. I hardly ever passed up the opportunity, the temptation to lust. For decades, it was my MO. It was my default. And when you practice something with that kind of repetition, it becomes integrated into your character. It becomes the most efficient path, as far as neural pathways go, for you to handle the test. And so I'm talking about thousands of failed tests when it comes to me and temptation in my past. It was integrated. Integrated meaning it didn't take effort. I didn't have to focus on objectifying. It was efficient. It didn't require focus of effort. It became integrated into my being, and it's how I engaged the world around me. Hardly ever passing up an opportunity to engage in that temptation. So I need to own that. And that's part of the shared reality with Jacqueline, is that was my past. That's what I did. Today, living in integrity is the effort, the development of integrating these two into my life. And so what that means is this. I try to navigate my life in such a way that I never even have to bounce my eyes. But if there is some sort of temptation in my environment, on a screen or on the street, in any way, I'd bounce my eyes and I'd pray for that person. That's bringing God into the equation. It goes from glance to God, and it bypasses gaze. There is to be no gaze. There is to be no long look of longing. I need to go straight from bouncing my eyes and bringing God into the equation. That I used to covertly undress women. That was lust. Now I covertly bless women by praying for them and protecting them from myself, honoring them as image bearers, as God's daughters, as someone else's covenant partner or future covenant partner. The Bible describes a wife as a treasure. When you are lusting after someone else's wife, it's theft. You are stealing someone else's treasure. That is not your treasure. That is what the Bible calls trespassing. And so the way I navigate this world is going from glance to God if there is a temptation around me, bouncing my eyes and praying for that person. And after doing that for several years now, here's what I've noticed. And the same hope is available for you too. That bouncing my eyes and praying has become integrated it's become the new default for me. It doesn't require effort. I've noticed that it just happens automatically now. Now, that doesn't mean that I've arrived and I can let my guard down and I don't have to contain my eyes. I don't have to have that covenant. I don't have to pre-decide what I'm. No, I will never, ever let go of the containment around my eyes. I will never lose the healthy respect that I have. But I have noticed that when it comes to just building a new neural pathway, it requires two things: intention and repetition. Do you want to remove lust from your life? And are you going to give enough reps of going from glance to God, where you're bypassing gaze, and that gazing, that lustful gazing neural pathway is now getting weaker and weaker and weaker in your life. And now I'm becoming the kind of man who does not objectify other people. That is being integrated into who I am. That's integrity. That is available for anyone. When I first entered recovery, I believed this lie: it's impossible not to lust. Impossible. There is no choice. I have no agency over this. When actually 1 Corinthians says every time we are tempted, God provides a door of escape. Every single time. What that means is we do have a choice. There's always an exit strategy. Always. I believe the lie that lust was inevitable and every man does it, and any man who says that he doesn't is lying. But now on this side of recovery and years of living lust-free, I can say it's totally within our agency. It is a choice. And if you get enough reps of bouncing the eyes and praying for this person, moving away from the old habit and embracing a new habit, it will become integrated into who you are. I say it's mutually beneficial because not only does it benefit me to make sure a glance never becomes a gaze, but it also provides safety for our partners. Because lust is internal. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know if you're lusting or not. All they can tell is, it looks like you just glanced at someone. Did that cross the line and become a lustful gaze? Did you objectify that person? And the more we can contain our eyes and make a covenant, pre-decide with our eyes, that I'm going to look down, or I'm just not going to go to this event, or I'm going to look at my partner, I'm going to maintain shared reality with her about how I handle temptation today so that she feels safe. The more we can minimize how much this happens, the more safe we are, but the more safe our partner feels. Early on after D-Day, because she doesn't feel safe, because of the betrayal trauma, even a glance feels so unsafe to her. And she is going to assume that that glance was a gaze, that temptation became lust for you. And why wouldn't she? That's what we did for, if you're like me, for years and decades. So of course her nervous system is going to register that as unsafe. One way that you can provide safety for both of you that's mutually beneficial is to make sure that you navigate your day and that even noticing temptation is minimal in your life. And what you do with that temptation, you make shared reality with her. If she has said, I want to know how you handle temptation, that would help me feel safe, then you make that part of your integrity. You maintain shared reality with her.